Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Genius of the System, Hollywood Filmmaking in the Studio Era, by Thomas Schatz. Preface by Stephen Bach. Narrated by Paul Boehmer. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you may hear references to visual elements present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Preface. The Center of Gravity. When The Genius of the System, Hollywood Filmmaking in the Studio Era was first published, I wrote that I thought it a necessary book. I did, and I do. Its reappearance now will enable it to join that slender selection of film books essential to scholars and a lasting delight to fans. The current edition is justified by many distinctions, as you will see, including a timeliness no one could have foreseen when it was originally published. I should confess my subjective credentials and bias right away. My first job in the movie business was in the studio system that is the main subject of this book. It was at MGM as the 60s turned into the 70s. Leo the Lion was wheezing his last ars gratia artis gasp, but remnants of the studio's structure and one-time glory lingered, if only in reproach. The first picture I ever worked on was photographed by William Daniels, who had been Garbo's great cinematographer and was still under studio contract in 1969. Editing was overseen by the legendary and formidable Margaret Booth, who had worked for Irving Thalberg and edited pictures like Camille and the original Mutiny on the Bounty. Within months, MGM's props, sets, costumes, and much of the magic they represented, including Dorothy's ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz, were on the auction block, placed there by a newly installed chief executive from television known as the Smiling Cobra. Later, as the 70s became the 80s, I was myself production head of a major company, United Artists. By then, a torpor seemed to paralyze much of the industry, and uncertainty and fickle audience taste were, like death and taxes, the only certainties. As one of those involved with the legendary disaster, Heaven's Gate, I played my role in that uncertainty verging on panic. I have done my mea culpas elsewhere, but as I've shed considerable blood of my own in the corridors of power and powerlessness, which are the concerns of this book, I claim a certain bruised authority in regarding it as necessary. It is so, I think, because Thomas Schatz provides the most insightful and well-researched examination of the studio system at its height that we have. He leads his audience with compelling narrative skill through Hollywood's golden age, how it grew, how it achieved what he calls that delicate equilibrium and marvelous symmetry that had so much to do with why the silver screen turned momentarily golden. The Genius of the System is far more ambitious than a mere history of the studio era. With a scholar's detachment, a critic's sensitivity, and the tenacious shrewdness of a detective, Mr. Schatz sweeps away the confusion, hearsay, and misinformation film history is plagued with. He expertly reveals what I think of as the center of creative gravity at the heart of the studio system and of this century's art form. I envy the first-time listener the experience of discovering that center with him. Mr. Schatz makes getting there as fascinating as it must have been to be there at the time, in a manner wholly persuasive and inordinately entertaining. That should be enough to make any book necessary. But there is more. In the time that has passed since The Genius of the System first appeared, The studio system has undergone yet another series of developments, even convulsions, that make the issues and content of this book more contemporary and pertinent than ever. Studios that seemed hidebound or moribund a decade ago, think of Disney, are immensely powerful and promise to be more so before you continue on. Warner Brothers, for years the most successful of the major companies, has itself undergone a bust-and-boom cycle over the last decade and is today a wholly different entity from what it was when this book was written. Columbia, Universal, MGM, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, and United Artists are all resurgent and, for all intents and purposes, different companies run by different people for different audiences. The movie business has always been unstable, or, to put it another way, dynamic. Public taste and the mysteries of the creative process evolve with the societies they mirror and sway. Their ability to do so, as Mr. Schatz demonstrates, is part of the genius of the system. As the new Hollywood searches to establish its own equilibrium, its own symmetry, we may be on the verge of all things, another golden age. The elements in today's crucible are remarkably like those Mr. Schatz discusses: talent, technological change, and, last but never least, money. First, talented people make the movies. Crass, greedy, power-mad as they are, and some of them are, they will endlessly search for their own profane forms of the Holy Grail. Without some kind of crusading tenacity and aspiration, they wouldn't last a minute in what they reverently call the business, and there wouldn't be any movies without them. Fortunately, they are not in short supply. There are probably more creative people per square inch in Hollywood than any place on earth, and most of them, I suspect, would much prefer doing better work than they're doing. Secondly, the technological changes of recent years and those yet to come are as volatile and full of promise as any we have ever known. Cable, satellite systems, and the ubiquitous VCR have brought tens of millions of viewers back to the movies. They may not be Billy Wilder's wonderful people out there in the dark, communally sharing an experience from the seats of the grand movie palaces of old, but those were mostly just real estate anyway. The point is that the theatrical film still drives the market, whether from a satellite 20,000 miles in the sky or down at the corner video rack. More importantly, the theatrical film still drives the imaginations of the talent, the filmmakers, and executives. Which brings us to money. It's always all about money, which is ignoble and all that, but movies simply can't be made without it. Ask any filmmaker. It is an art that is also an industry, and as Mr. Schatz demonstrates again and again, the relationship between money and creativity need not be malign. The two can, and often do, interact in what is fashionably called synergy, one enhancing or enabling the other. Schindler's List was made by Steven Spielberg, but it was made by Indiana Jones, too, just as David O. Selznick's Gone with the Wind depended less on Margaret Mitchell than on Selznick's track record with, among other things, King Kong. Schindler's List was also leveraged by Spielberg's blockbuster Jurassic Park and green-lighted by Universal MCA, which is to say, by Lew Wasserman and Sid Sheinberg, then the powers directing the Universal Empire. MCA itself has changed hands since then, of course, with control of the company going to Edgar Bronfman, Jr. of Seagram's. These are scarcely the studio power brokers of old, of course. In fact, The power of today's conglomerated moguls dwarfs that of their Golden Age predecessors. Today's moguls, Rupert Murdoch, say, of 20th Century Fox, or Michael Eisner of Disney, or Gerald Levin of Time Warner, are heads not of studios, but of global, multimedia empires. Mr. Murdoch owns not only his studio, but far-flung newspapers and a television network and a book publishing company. Mr. Eisner recently acquired ABC and Michael Ovitz to add to his several movie companies and theme parks. Mr. Levin heads not just Warner's, but what used to be Time Life, as well as HBO. These are men, or corporate entities, wielding power so immense that we are right to be concerned about their influence and attentive to their vision. They may well bring genius to it. Their possibilities to do so are awesome, and the alternative is awful to contemplate. No smiling cobra ever wielded such power or had such potential to cover himself and us with glory. One can only hope that the unworthy will flash for a moment and fade away, and that the good, yet to come, about which some next-century historian may write his or her own genius of the system, will remain, maybe even endure. It's happened before. Just listen. The idiosyncratic or autocratic-seeming decisions of the mayors, Zaneks, Thalbergs, and Selznicks did not prevent the first Golden Age, after all. They helped create it. As for the future of the movies, the audience is there. The money is there. The talent is there. You and I are part of all that. Our standards, our expectations, our demands. We are part of the system, as Mr. Schatz knows. I invite you to contemplate that as you discover the riches that follow for yourself. Stephen Bach. The genius of the system. The American cinema is a classical art, but why not then admire in it what is most admirable? That is, not only the talent of this or that filmmaker, but the genius of the system. André Bazin. Introduction. The whole equation of pictures. Walking at dawn in the deserted Hollywood streets in 1951 with David, Selznick, I listened to my favorite movie boss topple the town he had helped to build. The movies, said David, were over and done with. Hollywood was already a ghost town making foolish efforts to seem alive. But now that the tumult was gone, what had Hollywood been? Ben Hecht. David Selznick had a flair for the dramatic, and no one knew that better than Ben Hecht. The two collaborated on some of Hollywood's biggest hits, movies like Gone with the Wind and Notorious and Duel in the Sun, and often enough the making of those films was as rife with conflict as the films themselves, thanks to Selznick's ego and his unconventional working methods. In fact, Selznick, a major independent producer in the age of the big studios, saw his entire career in epic dramatic terms. David, amid a slew of Goliaths. But in the early 1950s, that scenario was changing rapidly. In 1953, Selznick wrote Louis B. Mayer, MGM's recently deposed studio boss, that all of Hollywood's old companies were still geared to a business that no longer exists. Selznick felt that everything from the production studios in Los Angeles to the worldwide marketing and distribution networks were predicated on a notion of movie-making, and of movies themselves, for which there was no longer a market. This was scarcely a cause for celebration, since Selznick was learning how little real independence he had from the entrenched movie companies and their way of doing business. He was barely 50 years old, and his earlier blockbusters were virtual prototypes for the independent productions that now ruled the marketplace, and yet he felt himself going under with the old studios. By the decade's end, he was ready to write his own, as well as Hollywood's epitaph. Selznick told one of his former partners in 1958 that their old stomping ground had become very mixed up and unhappy. He went on to eulogize the pioneers and moguls, a vanishing breed now that the industry was a half-century old, and he closed with the observation that Hollywood's big companies were staying alive only through the momentum and the motion pictures created in earlier years. The big companies, like MGM and Paramount and Warner Brothers, continued to survive, of course. Indeed, they flourished in the age of television and the new Hollywood. But things had changed since that halcyon era when Selznick and Hecht and Mayer were making movies. Gone was the cartel of movie factories that turned out a feature every week for 100 million moviegoers. Gone were the studio bosses who answered to the New York office and oversaw hundreds, even thousands of contract personnel working on the lot. Gone was the industrial infrastructure, the integrated system whose major studio powers not only produced and distributed movies, but also ran their own theater chains. Something was over and done with in the early 1950s, all right, but it wasn't the movies. It was the studio system of movie-making and the near-absolute power that the studio wielded over the American movie industry. The Hollywood studio system emerged during the teens and took its distinctive shape in the 1920s. It reached maturity during the 1930s, peaked in the war years, but then went into a steady decline after the war, done in by various factors, from government antitrust suits and federal tax laws to new entertainment forms and massive changes in American lifestyles. As the public shifted its viewing habits during the 1950s from going to the movies to watching TV, the studios siphoned off their theater holdings, fired their contract talent, and began leasing their facilities to independent filmmakers and TV production companies. By the 1960s, MGM and Warner's and the others were no longer studios, really. They were primarily financing and distribution companies for pictures that were packaged by agents or independent producers, or worse yet, by the stars and directors who once had been at the studio's beck and call. The collapse of the studio system was bound to provoke questions like Ben Hecht's. What had Hollywood been? And the answers have been plentiful, but less than adequate. Hecht himself answered, as so many of his industry colleagues did, with an anecdotal, self-serving memoir laced with venom for the system and for the Philistines who controlled it, and who paid Hecht up to $5,000 a week for his services as a screenwriter. Hecht was an essential part of that system, of course, though he hardly saw things that way, and his reminiscence was less revealing of Hollywood filmmaking than of the attitudes of Eastern-bred writers toward the priorities and the power structure in the movie industry. Hecht's answer did provide yet another piece of evidence to be factored in, along with the countless other interviews and autobiographies, critical studies, and economic analyses. But the accumulated evidence scarcely adds up, and our sense of what Hollywood had been remained a vague impression, fragmented and contradictory, more mythology than history. Promising to change all that, a cadre of critics and historians in the 1960s and 1970s cultivated a theory of film history based on the notion of directorial authorship. As the new Hollywood emerged from the ashes of the studio era, proponents of the auteur theory proclaimed that what the old Hollywood had been was a director's cinema. They proclaimed, too, that the only film directors worthy of canonization as author-artists were those whose personal style emerged from a certain antagonism toward the studio system at large, the dehumanizing, formulaic, profit-hungry machinery of Hollywood's studio factories. The auteurist's chief proponent was Andrew Sarris, who in his landmark study, The American Cinema, Directors and Directions, 1929 to 1968, cast the studio boss as the heavy in Hollywood's epic struggle and reduced American film history to the careers of a few dozen heroic directors. Keying on an observation by director George Stevens that as the industry took shape, the filmmaker became the employee, and the man who had time to attend to the business details became the head of the studio. Sarris developed a simplistic theory of his own, celebrating the director as the sole purveyor of film art in an industry overrun with hacks and profit-mongers. The closing words of his introduction said it all. He, the director, would not be worth bothering with if he were not capable now and then of a sublimity of expression almost miraculously extracted from his money-oriented environment. Auteurism itself would not be worth bothering with if it hadn't been so influential, effectively stalling film history and criticism in a prolonged stage of adolescent romanticism. But the closer we look at Hollywood's relations of power and hierarchy of authority during the studio era, at its division of labor and assembly line production process, the less sense it makes to assess filmmaking, or film style, in terms of the individual director, or any individual, for that matter. The key issues here are style and authority, creative expression and creative control, and there were indeed a number of Hollywood directors who had an unusual degree of authority and a certain style. John Ford, Howard Hawks, Frank Capra, and Alfred Hitchcock are good examples, but it's worth noting that their privileged status, particularly their control over script development, casting, and editing, was more a function of their role as producers than as directors. Such authority came only with commercial success and was won by filmmakers who proved not just that they had talent, but that they could work profitably within the system. These filmmakers were often difficult for a studio to handle, perhaps, but no more so than its top stars or writers, and ultimately they got going, doing what Ford called a job of work, and moving on to the next project. In fact, they did their best and most consistent work on calculated star vehicles for one particular studio, invariably in symbiosis with an authoritative studio boss. Consider Ford's work with Darryl Zanuck at 20th Century Fox on a succession of Henry Fonda pictures, Young Mr. Lincoln, Drums Along the Mohawk, and The Grapes of Wrath, or Alfred Hitchcock doing Spellbound and Notorious, two psychological dramas scripted by Ben Hecht and prepared by David Selznick for his European discovery, Ingrid Bergman, or Howard Hawks working for Jack Warner on To Have and Have Not and The Big Sleep, two hard-boiled thrillers with Bogart and Bacall that were steeped in the Warner's style. These were first-rate Hollywood films, but they were no more distinctive than other star-genre formulations turned out by routine contract directors. Universal's horror films with Boris Karloff, directed by James Whale, for instance, or the Paul Muni biopics directed by William Dieterle for Warner's. Whale and Dieterle are rarely singled out for their style or artistry, and each would have been lost without the studio's resources and regimented production process. But that doesn't diminish the integrity of films like Frankenstein, The Old Dark House, and The Bride of Frankenstein, or The Story of Louis Pasteur and The Life of Émile Zola. The quality and artistry of all these films were the product not simply of individual human expression, but a melding of institutional forces. In each case, the style of a writer, director, star, or even a cinematographer, art director, or costume designer fused with the studio's production operations and management structure, its resources and talent pool, its narrative traditions, and market strategy. And ultimately, any individual's style was no more than an inflection on an established studio style. Think of Jimmy Cagney in Public Enemy, staggering down that dark, rain-drenched street after a climactic shootout with rival gangsters, gazing just past the camera and muttering, "I ain't so tough," then falling face down into the gutter. That was a signature Warner Brothers moment, a narrative cinematic epiphany when star and genre and technique coalesced into an ideal expression of studio style, vintage 1931. Other studios had equally distinctive styles and signature moments, involving different stars and story types and a different way of seeing in both a technical and an ideological sense. On a darkened, rain-drenched street at MGM, for instance, we might expect to find a glossy, upbeat celebration of life and love. Mickey Rooney in another Andy Hardy installment, struggling to get the top up on his old jalopy while his date gets soaked. Or Gene Kelly dancing through puddles and singing in the rain. Over at Universal, a late-night storm was likely to signal something more macabre. Count Dracula on the prowl, perhaps, or Dr. Frankenstein harnessing a bolt of lightning for some horrific experiment. These are isolated glimpses of a larger design, both on screen and off. Each top studio developed a repertoire of contract stars and story formulas that were refined and continually recirculated through the marketplace. Warner's in the 1930s, for example, cranked out urban crime films with Cagney and Edward G. Robinson, crusading biopics with Paul Muni, backstage musicals with Dick Powell and Ruby Keeler, epic swashbucklers with Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland, and in a curious counter to the studio's male ethos, a succession of women's pictures, starring Bette Davis. These stars and genres were the key markers in Warner's Depression-era style, the organizing principles for its entire operation from the New York office to the studio factory across the continent. They were a means of stabilizing marketing and sales, of bringing efficiency and economy into the production of some 50 feature films per year, and of distinguishing Warner's collective output from that of its competitors. The chief architects of a studio's style were its executives, which any number of Hollywood chronicles observed at the time. Among the more astute chroniclers was Leo Roston, who put it this way in Hollywood, the Movie Colony, an in-depth study published in 1940. Each studio has a personality. Each studio's product shows special emphases and values, and, in the final analysis, the sum total of a studio's personality, the aggregate pattern of its choices and its tastes, may be traced to its producers. For it is the producers who establish the preferences, the prejudices, and the predispositions of the organization, and, therefore, of the movies which it turns out. Roston was not referencing the supervisors and associate producers who monitored individual productions, nor to the pioneering movie moguls who controlled economic policy from New York. He was referring to studio production executives like Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg at MGM, Jack Warner and Hal Wallace at Warner Brothers, Darryl Zanuck at 20th Century Fox, Harry Cohn at Columbia, and major independent producers like David Selznick and Sam Goldwyn. These men, and they were always men, translated an annual budget handed down by the New York office into a program of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?